I still remember the sound more than anything else. Not the screams, not the sirens, not even the questions that came later. Just the sound the playground made when it went suddenly quiet, like someone had slammed a door on summer itself. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 58 years old, and for almost 3 decades, I've lived with one simple fact. I was the last adult to see 5-year-old Samanta Railly before she vanished from that Chicago playground without a trace. People love to say they remember exactly where they were when something terrible happened. The truth is, most of them are lying to themselves. Memory gets polished over time, like a stone in a river, rounded and smoothed until it fits the story we want to tell. But that afternoon in 1997 never smoothed out for me. It stayed jagged. The case files call it an unsolved Chicago cold case. The news back then called it the playground vanishing. But for me, it was just a 20-minute coffee break that ruined my life. Hook, right? A little girl vanishes at a crowded playground in broad daylight, and the only witness whose story doesn't quite add up is me. That's what the detectives thought, anyway. What they never understood, what no one ever really wanted to hear, is that what happened to Samanta didn't feel normal. It didn't feel like an abduction or a runaway or a custody dispute. It felt like the world hiccuped. But if you start a story with reality broke for a second, people decide you're crazy before you get to the important parts. So for years, I stuck to the safer version. Dates, times, positions, distances. How far she was from the bench. How many kids were on the swings. Which direction the sun was hitting the slide. It's only now, talking into this little microphone on my kitchen table, that I'm finally ready to tell the version I've kept to myself. The one where the shadows moved the wrong way. The one where a child's voice didn't echo when it should have. The one where something invisible brushed past me, carrying the cold of a winter that hadn't arrived yet. But that's getting ahead of the story. Back then, in June of '97, I was a maintenance tech for the City Parks and Recreation Division. Fancy way of saying I fixed broken swings, unclogged public restroom sinks, and painted over graffiti that always seemed to come back faster than the paint could dry. I wasn't a cop, or a detective, or some armchair investigator. I was the guy with the toolbox and bad knees. The playground at 73rd and Halsted wasn't special. Chain-link fence, faded slides, rubbery ground that smelled like hot tires when the sun hit it. A couple of picnic tables, a drinking fountain that worked only if you caught it at the right angle, and one oak tree that did more work-shading kids than the whole city planning department. It was a Thursday. I remember that. Hot even for June. The kind of Chicago heat that doesn't just sit on your skin, but crawls down the back of your neck and settles there. I was supposed to be there for an hour, replace a loose bolt on the merry-go-round, check the swings, and file a report. Instead, I ended up giving a statement in a police station under fluorescent lights that made everyone look guilty. Samanta was there with her mother and a group of other parents. Field trip, birthday party, church outing, depends on which witness you believe. What I remember is a cluster of adults around a picnic table, paper plates, juice boxes, and a small mountain of potato salad that nobody seemed to want in that kind of heat. And a girl in a yellow t-shirt, too big for her, with a cartoon rabbit on the front. Light brown hair in 2 uneven ponytails. Pink sneakers with a blinking light in the heel. That's Samanta, at least. That's how she exists in my mind, frozen mid-laugh, just before everything went wrong. She had this habit, noticed it instantly, of running, and stopping dead like she'd hit an invisible wall, looking around as if listening for something only she could hear. Kids get distracted. They chase butterflies, ice cream trucks, other kids. Samanta would just pause, head tilted, eyes a little unfocused. The first few times, I thought nothing of it. By the 4th or 5th, the hair on my arms started to rise. I was crouched by the merry-go-round, wrench in hand, pretending not to people watch. The job teaches you that. You act invisible, and people forget you're there. They speak more freely. They argue. They confess. They fall apart. You learn a lot about a neighborhood that way. At 2:13 p.m., I know the time because I checked my watch right before it happened. Samanta was near the sandbox, not 20 feet from me. She was alone for maybe 3 seconds tops. Her mother thin, tired, late 30s, maybe was cutting a hot dog in half and arguing with one of the other adults about something I couldn't hear. The other kids were clustered on the swings and the slide. No strangers hanging around the fence. No white van idling nearby. No movie-style kidnapper in a trench coat. Just heat, the squeak of the swings, the slap of sneakers on rubber. And then something shifted. Imagine watching an old home video when the tape catches for a second, the image jerks, and then continues. Nothing looks wrong, exactly, but you know there was a glitch. That's what it felt like. Except I wasn't watching a screen, I was inside it. The air went heavy, like a storm was about to break, but the sky was clear. The oak tree's shadow stretched just a fraction too far, pulling across the sandbox like someone had tugged on it. The sounds of the playground dropped in volume, like someone turned a dial. Samanta froze mid-step, one foot half buried in the sand. Her head tilted again, that same odd angle, but her face changed. The carefree look flickered into something else. Confusion. And then something close to recognition. I remember thinking, she looks like she just heard her name. A small gust of wind cut across the playground, out of nowhere. Not from the lake, not from the street, but from behind me, where there should have been nothing but the park fence and the alley beyond. It carried with it a cold that didn't belong to June. Chicago can turn on you, sure, but not like that. Not with a gust that smells like snow and hospital corridors. The hair on my neck stood up. The wrench slipped a little in my hand. Samanta turned her head slightly toward the empty space behind me, eyes widening just a bit. Her lips moved. I swear to you, to this day, it looked like she mouthed, "Okay," not "Mom," not "No," just "Okay," as if answering someone. Then came the silence. It wasn't that the sound stopped entirely. The swing still squeaked. Tires still hummed on the road somewhere beyond the trees. But everything felt distant, like I'd been shoved into a room with thick glass walls. My own breathing sounded too loud. I blinked. Maybe it was a second. Maybe less. When I looked back at the sandbox, Samanta was gone. Not walking away. Not running. Not being led by the hand by some stranger I'd missed. Gone. The sand still held the shallow impression of her sneaker. Half moon of pink blinking light pressed into the grit. No other footprints nearby. No path leading away. Just one almost print, like a sentence that stopped mid-word. I stood up so fast my knees popped. My first thought wasn't abduction. It was she fell. Fell where? I couldn't have told you, because there was nothing to fall into. But the feeling was so strong. I checked the ground anyway, like there might be a trapdoor hiding under 2 inches of sand. "Hey, kiddo," I called out, trying to keep my voice light. I scanned the slide, the climbing frame, the tree. Where'd you go? Kids don't just disappear. Even when they hide, you catch a flash of color, the sound of a giggle, the rustle of movement. There was nothing. "Sammy!" A woman's voice shouted behind me, sharp enough to make me flinch. Her mother. She'd finally looked up. I turned, and for a bizarre half-second, I expected to see Samanta right there at the table, like I'd imagined the whole thing. But there were only juice boxes, napkins, a lopsided cake, and a circle of adults whose faces went from irritated to terrified in the span of a heartbeat. "Samanta?" Her mother called again, stepping away from the table, so fast her chair tipped backward and hit the dirt. "Sammy, this isn't funny." The other adults started looking around casually at first, then not so casually. You could see the moment it clicked for each of them. "We do not see her." I opened my mouth to say, she was just here, but the words stuck. How do you explain that just here and completely gone were maybe 3 heartbeats apart? I walked back to the sandbox, kicked at the sand like maybe she'd burrowed down. My brain was serving up stupid ideas, panicked ideas. Was she with you? A man's voice snapped at me. He was 40-something, stocky, a white socks cap pulled low. I would later learn he was an uncle, or claimed to be. I was fixing the I lifted the wrench, as if that proved anything. She was right there. I pointed. I wished I hadn't. It made the whole thing feel like a magic trick gone wrong. Within minutes, the search started small under the slides, around the oak, behind the bathroom building, then ballooned outward. Neighbors came out, some curious, some concerned. Cars slowed. Someone called 911. I kept expecting that familiar ending, the rushed relief of, there she is, by the bushes. What were you thinking, young lady? The scolding, the crying, the laughter that covers fear. It never came. And through it all, I couldn't shake that moment. The stretched shadow, the wrong season wind, the tiny nod of a child saying okay to something nobody else could see. That was the hook of the whole thing, though I didn't have words for it then. This wasn't just a missing kid. It felt like the world had a tear in it, right there in that sandbox, and Samanta had slipped through. I didn't tell the police that, not that first day. I told them times, distances, positions, that she'd been maybe 20 feet from me, that I'd looked away for a second to check the bolt, that when I looked back, she was gone. I could see it in their eyes. They heard something I wasn't saying. Because when a 5-year-old vanishes from a crowded playground in Chicago on a clear June afternoon, and the only adult close enough to see anything swears he didn't see a thing, the question isn't what happened. It's who's lying. And from the way they stared at me over their notepads, I knew they'd already picked their answer. The first officer on scene was a young guy who looked too, fresh-faced for the South Side. His uniform still had that stiff, just-issued look, and when he stepped out of the squad car, he tried to put on his serious cop face, but his eyes kept flicking around like he was searching for the part of the script where this got easy. He walked straight toward the cluster of adults, hands raised in that calming gesture they must teach at the academy. And before he even said a word, Samanta's mother grabbed his forearm and started talking so fast the words piled on top of each other. I watched his expression shift from this might be nothing to this is bad in about 10 seconds. By then, more officers were already on the way. Sirens in the distance, the rising murmur of bystanders, the ripple of panic that spreads faster than any rumor ever could. I stood near the merry go-round, wrench still in my hand like an idiot, feeling more and more like a prop that had been left in the frame by mistake. I kept looking at that shallow print in the sand where her tiny sneaker had been, the half-moon shape already softening at the edges as if the day itself wanted to erase it. The rational part of my brain kept saying, you must have missed her walking away. You must have blinked. You must have looked down longer than you remember. But there was another part, the one that remembered that cold gust and the way the sound had dropped out, whispering, no, you saw exactly what happened, which is nothing. She was there, and then she wasn't. They pulled me in quickly, because I was closest. One of the older officers, gray at the temples, sun-creased face, came over with a little notebook that looked too small for the weight of what he was about to write down. You work for the city? He asked, nodding at my shirt. I told him yeah. Maintenance, parks and rec. He glanced at the merry-go-round, then back at me. So you were fixing that when she disappeared? His tone was casual, but his pen was already poised. I told him the truth, that I'd been checking the bolts, that I'd seen her near the sandbox, not 10 seconds before her mother called out, that there hadn't been anyone near her. He didn't like that answer. Or maybe he didn't like that. I sounded too sure. No one else close? No car pulled up? Nobody talking to her? I shook my head and felt the first real wave of nausea. Saying it out loud made it more real. A child had vanished from arm's length, and I had nothing useful to offer. They swept the playground, then the surrounding block, then the alleys. More squad cars showed up, and a sergeant, then what looked like a detective in a shirt that had lost a battle with the Chicago humidity. The crowd at the fence grew: kids on bikes, an old man with a grocery cart, a teenage couple who clearly hadn't planned on ending their afternoon watching someone else's nightmare. Someone started crying a half block away. Someone else started praying under their breath. There are certain sounds you only hear when something has gone very wrong, and all of them were there that day. I was escorted to a bench under the oak tree and told to just sit tight for a minute. That minute turned into 30. Every few minutes a different officer came by to ask the same questions in slightly different order. Had I seen anyone watching the kids? Had I noticed a car circling? Had I seen Samantha talk to anyone? Had she looked scared? Had she looked like she was trying to run? Each time I gave the same answers, and each time they were polite, but there was that little tightening at the corners of the mouth, that careful tone that says, "We're not accusing you, but we're definitely not letting you walk away either." At one point, I almost told them everything: the strange quiet, the wrong season wind, the way her lips had formed that word to no one. But I could picture exactly how that would land. A blue-collar maintenance guy, on a hot day, alone with a bunch of kids at a playground, claiming reality had glitched right before one of them vanished. Best case, they write me off as a nut. Worst case, they decide crazy is just another flavor of guilty. So I swallowed it and stuck to measurements. 20 feet, 10 seconds. Yellow T-shirt, pink shoes with lights in the heels. When they finally drove me to the station for a formal statement, the sun was already sliding toward late afternoon, turning the playground into a long smear of shadow behind us. I remember looking back through the squad car window and having the irrational thought that if I stared hard enough, I'd see that moment rewind, the shadow shrinking back, the wind returning to normal, the sound rising again, and a little girl reappearing exactly where she'd been, mid-step in the sand. It didn't happen, of course. The sandbox stayed empty. Some stories don't rewind. The interrogation room was smaller than on TV and smelled faintly of old coffee and cleaning chemicals. A metal table, 2 chairs, a big rectangular mirror on the wall that wasn't fooling anyone. The detective from the playground introduced himself as Detective Moran, mid-40s, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, the kind of man who looked permanently unimpressed. He slid a styrofoam cup of water toward me and sat down across the table with an open file that had almost nothing in it yet. "Daniel Carter," he read from my ID. "58? Been with the city how long?" I told him. He made a little noise that might have been approval, might have been nothing. He started slow, conversational, like we were just 2 guys at a bar talking about a ball game. Walk him through my day. What time did I get to the park? Who assigned the work order? Did I talk to any of the parents before I started? Any of the kids? If I hadn't been so rattled, I might have admired the technique. He let me relax just enough to forget I was under a microscope, then dropped the questions that mattered. "You ever see that little girl before today?" "No." "You ever worked this playground before?" "Yes, a few times." "Any complaints about you from parents? Anybody ever say you made them uncomfortable?" "No." The no came out too fast, too sharp. Even I heard it. He tapped his pen on the table, made a little show of considering my answers, then leaned back. "Here's my problem, Mr. Carter," he said, and the fake friendliness drained out of his voice. "We've got a 5-year-old who disappears from a public park in broad daylight. We've got multiple adults who claim they were watching the kids, but nobody saw her leave. We've got no car description, no stranger, No argument. No nothing. What we do have. He paused, letting the silence stretch until I felt it in my teeth. What we do have is you. The only adult within 10, 15 feet of that girl when she was last seen. And you're telling me you didn't see a damn thing. My chest tightened. It wasn't anger. Not at first, just a heavy, sinking shame. Like I had personally failed some unspoken test of adulthood. Kids are supposed to be safe around you. You're supposed to notice when something's wrong. You're not supposed to be the man who looks away for 1 second and loses a child. I'm telling you exactly what happened, I said, keeping my voice as even as I could. She was near the sandbox. I was working. I looked at her. I looked back at the bolt. When I looked up, she was gone. I don't know how else to say it. Moran watched me for a beat, then leaned forward, forearms on the table. You ever lose time, Mr. Carter? He asked. The question caught me off guard. What? He repeated it, slower. You ever blank out? Have blackouts? Drink on the job? I shook my head. He nodded, as if I'd confirmed something for him anyway. Here's why I ask. People are terrible narrators of their own lives. They forget things. They smooth over the ugly parts. They say it was 10 seconds when it was really a minute. They say, I looked away when what they mean is, I wasn't paying attention. You get what I'm saying? I did. And he wasn't wrong, not in general. People misremember. They misjudge time and distance. They protect themselves without even realizing it. But this was different. That moment was seared into me with such clarity that even years later, I could still count the heartbeats. Detective, I said quietly, I know what 10 seconds feels like. I know the difference between not paying attention and whatever that was. I almost said in watching the world skip, but I bit it back. He would hear crazy, not truth. He studied my face for a long time, looking for something fear, guilt, a telltale twitch. I gave him what I had, confusion, exhaustion, a bone-deep sense of having been present for something I didn't have language for. In the end, he just sighed and closed the notebook. All right, for now, you're a witness. Don't leave town. Don't talk to the press. And if you remember anything, and I mean anything, you call me. He slid a card across the table, his number. The words Special Victims printed in small, neat type. On my way out of the station, I passed a room where Samantha's mother sat with another officer. Her shoulders were shaking, her hands locked around a crumpled tissue. For a split second, her eyes met mine through the half-open door. There was no accusation in them, not yet. Just a hollow terror that didn't have a place to land. That would come later, when the hours turned into days and the detectives kept circling back to the same point. I was the last one close enough to stop it, and I didn't. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the TV on mute, the detective's card in front of me, and replayed the scene over and over. The sandbox, the shadow stretching, the sudden chill, the way the sound had dullened, like someone had thrown a blanket over the world, and Samantha's tiny, serious face, the way her lips had formed at one simple word. Okay. The more I thought about it, the less it felt like a child being surprised, and the more it felt like someone responding to a familiar call. Not fear, not refusal, acceptance. When you're alone with a memory long enough, it starts to grow extra parts. You question which details were really there, and which ones are your brain trying to make sense of the senseless. Was the wind really that cold? Or did my mind add that later to match the story I now tell myself? Did the shadow really move wrong? Or was it just the sun slipping behind a cloud? I kept asking myself those questions until the clock dragged its way past midnight, then 2, then 3. At some point, I must have dozed off in the chair because I woke up to the gray pre-dawn light and a sound that didn't belong in my apartment at all. A child's laugh. It was distant, echoing, thin, like it was coming through a wall or from far down a hallway that didn't exist in my one-bedroom place. I sat up so fast my neck spasmed, heart pounding. The TV was still on mute, frozen on some infomercial. The fridge hummed quietly in the kitchen. Outside, the city was in that strange, in-between silence before the first buses and garbage trucks started their morning chorus. And somewhere, in that muted world, I heard it again. A small, delighted giggle. It sounded exactly like it had on the playground. The second laugh was closer. Not loud, just a soft, breathy giggle. The kind kids make when they're trying to hide, but can't quite contain their excitement. Every instinct I had screamed that it had to be coming from the hallway, or the apartment next door, or the TV, or anywhere normal. But the rational part of my mind was still wiped out from the night before, and the first thought that actually formed was, the playground followed you home. I pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping the floor, and just stood there, listening. It's strange how loud your own heartbeat can sound when you're trying to pick up something faint. The apartment was too still, like even the building was holding its breath. No footsteps above, no muffled arguments from down the hall, none of the usual city noise leaking through the thin walls, no sirens, no buses, no car horns. Just my pulse and that lingering echo of a child's laugh that did not belong in a middle-aged man's kitchen at 4 a.m. Hello? The word came out hoarse and stupid, but it was all I had. My voice sounded wrong in the silence, too sharp, like it didn't match the room. I waited, half expecting an answer, some kid's voice saying they'd slipped in by mistake, that they were lost, that this was all just an ordinary, solvable problem, but nothing came back. I walked toward the living room, every step deliberate, my bare feet cold on the floor. The TV's blue glow painted the walls in that dead, artificial light that makes everything look a little haunted. I checked behind the couch, even though I knew damn well a 5-year-old couldn't have gotten in without me waking up. I opened the closet by the front door, pushed aside the coats, scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the faint smell of dust and old fabric and my own nerves. By the time I'd checked the bathroom and bedroom, I felt ridiculous, like one of those people who swears a house is haunted because the pipes make noise at night. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom, hand on the frame, and forced myself to slow my breathing. "You're tired," I muttered. "You didn't sleep. You've had cops in your face all day. Your brain is doing what brains do when they're overloaded." That's what I told myself, anyway. But underneath the rationalization was a colder thought I didn't want to acknowledge yet. It hadn't sounded like just any child. It had sounded like her. I went back to the kitchen, turned on the faucet just to hear something normal, and splashed water on my face. The man in the dark window over the sink looked older than 58 deep lines, red eyes, silver at the temples that hadn't been there a few years before. Guilt ages you faster than time, I guess. I shut off the water, and that was when I noticed it. For the second time in 24 hours, the world had gone just a little too quiet. It wasn't as dramatic as at the playground, no wrong-way shadows, no sudden weight in the air, but the fridge hum seemed to fade. The faint traffic outside dulled, as if someone were slowly turning the city's volume knob down again. "Don't," I whispered to no one in particular. "Don't do that." I wasn't sure who I was talking to. God, the universe. Whatever had been waiting at the edge of that sandbox. My own imagination. It didn't matter. The hush settled in anyway, wrapping around me in that same muffled way, like I'd stepped into a recording studio, and the sound, dampening foam was swallowing everything. I stood completely still and listened. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then, from the far corner of the room, by the empty wall where there should have been a dining table, if I'd ever gotten around to buying one, I heard it. The scrape of something small across the floor. Light. Uneven. I turned my head slowly, like sudden movements might break whatever thin line separated me from sanity. There was nothing there, just the worn linoleum, the scuffed baseboard, the blank wall. But the sound came again, a little closer this time. A soft, hollow clack, 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 like plastic hitting tile. My brain, traitor that it is, supplied a memory before I could stop it. Pink sneakers with blinking lights in the heels, the way they flashed when she ran, the tiny hard tap when they hit the ground. I swallowed hard, throat dry. Samanta? The name felt strange in my mouth, like saying it out loud might make it too real. No answer. Just one more clack, right by my left foot. I looked down. Nothing. No shoes, no small figure, no outline of a child. But for a fraction of a second, just at the edge of vision, I could have sworn I saw a faint shimmer in the air, like heat rising from asphalt. Only this wasn't summer sun. It was pre-dawn gray, and the air in my apartment was cool. The shimmer pulsed once and then was gone, and with it, the unnatural quiet. The fridge hum rushed back, a car horn blared faintly outside, and the pipes creaked in the wall like the building had exhaled. I was alone again. There are moments in life when you hit a crossroads you never see coming. A doctor points at a shadow on a scan. A phone rings in the middle of the night. Or you wake up because you heard a child laugh in an empty apartment, and you have to decide whether you're going to pretend it was a dream or accept that your world just tilted a few degrees off its axis. That morning, standing barefoot in my kitchen with a phantom echo still ringing in my ears, I did what most people would do. I chose denial, but only halfway. I told myself I was exhausted, that my mind was playing tricks, but I also knew, deep down where the comfortable lies don't reach, that I'd heard something real. I went to work that day anyway. That's what you do when you don't know what else to do. Cling to routine like a life raft. The guys at the yard gave me the kind of looks reserved for people who've been on the news for the wrong reasons. A couple avoided my eyes completely. One of them, Mike, a big guy with a soft heart and too many kids of his own, clapped me on the shoulder and mumbled, "Hell of a thing, Dan. They'll find her. They always do on TV, right?" It was meant as comfort, but it landed like a bad joke. Real life wasn't TV. On TV, the missing child comes back by the third act or is avenged by the credits. In real life, stories just stop. By noon, I'd been pulled into the supervisor's office and politely told to take a few days. It wasn't punishment, at least not officially. Liability, they called it. Optics. A man tied to an active investigation shouldn't be wandering around city parks with a toolbox. Not when every parent in Chicago was suddenly seeing my face on the 6 o'clock news next to the words, "Last person to see her." I didn't argue. Part of me was relieved. The other part felt like I was being quietly pushed out of the frame so someone else could rewrite the scene without me in it. The days that followed blurred together in that way. Only people touched by tragedy really understand. Interviews. Follow-up interviews. A canvas of the neighborhood. TV vans parked near the playground, their antennae poking at the sky like they were trying to pull answers down by force. For a while, the city cared. Samanta's picture school-style portrait, hair tidied, eyes bright, was everywhere. On telephone poles, in shop windows, on the local news right between weather and sports. "If you've seen this child," the anchor would say, voice dipped in practiced sympathy. I'd change the channel, but there she'd be again, on another network, the same photograph, the same appeal. And through it all, there were the little things, the flickers. I'd be walking down the hallway in my building and feel a sudden patch of cold air, like I'd stepped through an invisible curtain. I'd be making coffee and catch a flash of yellow at the corner of my eye, a T, a darting movement only to turn and find the room empty. Once, crossing a street, I heard the squeak of a swing chain above the traffic noise, clear as day, and nearly turned back toward the park before remembering I was nowhere near it. I told myself these were just symptoms of obsession. I'd been in shock. I'd been questioned endlessly. Of course, my brain was replaying the one image it couldn't file away neatly. That's what trauma does, right? But there was one incident I couldn't explain away, no matter how hard I tried. About a week after the disappearance, Detective Moran called and asked me to meet him back at the playground. "Walk me through it again," he said over the phone. "Humor me." His tone gave nothing away. When I got there, the park felt different. The playground was the same, the slides, the swings, the sandbox, but the air around it had changed. Fewer kids. More parents watching like hawks. A bouquet of wilting flowers tied to the fence with a stuffed rabbit sagging in the heat. The kind of small shrine that says, "We don't know what happened, but we're afraid to admit the worst." Moran was watching the sandbox when I approached, hands in his pockets, tie looser than usual. He nodded at me, then at the spot where I'd pointed a dozen times already. "Here?" he asked. "This is where you saw her last?" I said yes, and stepped closer, planting my foot where I remembered hers had been. For a second, everything was normal kids shouting, traffic on Halsted, a dog barking somewhere. Then that familiar, suffocating quiet started to fold in around me again. Not as strong as the first time, but unmistakable. The hairs on my arms rose. My breath hitched. "Do you feel that?" I asked before I could stop myself. "Feel what?" Moran's tone was flat, skeptical. He looked around, probably expecting to see some guy selling ice cream or starting a fight. The air," I said, instantly regretting it. I sounded like a lunatic, like it just got heavier. I forced a laugh that fooled no one. "Probably the heat." He squinted at me like he was filing that reaction away for later, then told me to go ahead and walk through it again, step by step, like a bad reenactment. I did as he asked. I pointed to the merry-go-round. I mimed crouching with the wrench. I turned my head toward where she had been, and when I looked back at the sandbox, my stomach dropped. There, right where I'd told him her foot had been, was a single small, fresh footprint. It couldn't have been left over from that day. Kids had been playing in that sand all week. The surface had been churned, smoothed, dug up, and rebuilt into castles and craters and tunnels 100 times. But this print was crisp, shallow, like someone had just stepped there. Same size, same partial angle, heel just off the ground, toes pressing forward as if mid-step. No other prints leading to it or away from it, just that one, like a punctuation mark at the end of an unfinished sentence. "Hey," I said, my voice thinner than I liked. Did someone stage this?" I pointed, and for a split second, before he schooled his features, I saw it on Moran's face. Genuine confusion. He crouched, leaned in, studied the print like it might rearrange itself into an answer if he glared hard enough. "Sand gets weird," he said finally, but there was no conviction in it. "Kids running around, wind, shadows. You sure you didn't just miss that before?" "I've been here 3 times since it happened," I replied quietly. "Trust me, I'd have noticed." He looked up at me, eyes searching, then stood and brushed the sand off his hands. "Things get messy in people's heads after something like this," he said. "You see patterns because you're looking for them. You hear things that aren't there. You want a sign." I almost told him about the laugh in my apartment, about the phantom footsteps, about the way the world seemed to hold its breath around certain places and certain moments now. Instead, I just nodded and let him think I was another man trying to cling to something that made no sense. Maybe I was. Maybe that footprint was just an odd trick of kids' shoes and shifting sand. But as I stood there, the muted hum wrapping around us again for a heartbeat, I had the creeping feeling that the playground wasn't finished with me yet. That night, I laid awake and thought about something I hadn't considered before. We like to think of time as this straight line we all move along together. You wake up, you go to work, you eat, you sleep. Minutes follow minutes, days follow days, like beads on a string. But what if, every once in a while, the string knots? What if there are places, little pockets, where the line loops over itself, where one moment brushes against another that doesn't belong? A playground in Chicago. A middle-aged man's kitchen. A child's laugh that doesn't know where it's supposed to be. Maybe Samantha hadn't been taken in the way everyone assumed. Maybe she'd slipped sideways into one of those knots. And maybe, just maybe, I was standing close enough when it happened that some part of me had been pulled along the edge. The thought should have scared me more than it did. Instead, it felt like the first explanation that didn't require a monster in a van or a stranger with a candy story. Not that those monsters don't exist, they do. And I'd heard enough stories over the years to know that the worst things people do to each other are almost always depressingly ordinary. But nothing about that day had felt ordinary, and the more I tried to stuff it into a normal box, the more it refused to fit. I didn't know it yet, but the case wasn't just going to haunt me in my sleep or in the shifts of air in my apartment. It was going to follow me in ways I couldn't imagine, through other parks, other disappearances, other strange little pockets where the world didn't quite behave. Samanta Railly's name would show up in places it had no business being. And I was going to learn that what happened at that playground wasn't a one-time glitch. It was a pattern. I just hadn't seen the rest of the shape yet. For a while, the pattern stayed mostly in my head. A laugh where it shouldn't be, a cold spot in a warm room, a shadow that seemed to stretch just a little too far. If I'd kept it to myself, maybe it all would have faded, filed away under bad year like an old receipt. But the universe, or whatever passes for it, has a cruel sense of timing. It waited until the story had gone cold for everyone else before it decided to turn the heat up under me. Officially, the case went from active search to open investigation to cold file in less than 18 months. Unofficially, it took about 2 weeks for the news crews to get bored. The first days were a circus. Cameras, reporters with sad eyes and practiced concern, neighbors lining up to say on live TV that they never thought something like this could happen here, even though things like that happen here all the time, just to other people. Then, as always, something newer, louder, bloodier took over the headlines. A shooting, a fire, a scandal at City Hall. The missing little girl's photo got pushed further back in the broadcasts until she was just a faded flyer on a bulletin board and a file in a cabinet in a building that already had too many of both. I went back to work. Bills have no sense of tragedy. For a while, my coworkers tiptoed around me like grief might be contagious. Then they stopped. You can't sustain that level of pity forever, especially when the person you're pitying keeps showing up at 7 a.m. with coffee and a toolbox, trying very hard to be normal. And I did try. I avoided the playground on 73rd and Halsted when I could, traded shifts, took assignments on the north side or by the lake. When I couldn't avoid it, I showed up, did my job, and did not under any circumstances look at the sandbox for longer than it took to make sure no bolts were loose and no boards were rotten. It might have worked, that slow, stubborn return to routine. If not for the night, the playground came to me in a way that even denial couldn't handle. It was late autumn by then, one of those Chicago evenings where the wind coming off the lake feels like it's got a vendetta. I'd just gotten home from a double shift. The city had decided to cram a year's worth of park repairs into 3 months before the budget reset. My hands ached, my back ached, my brain ached. I microwaved something that claimed to be dinner, sat down in front of the TV, and let the flicker of some forgettable show wash over me. The apartment was warm, the kind of artificial heating that dries out your nose and makes you sleepy. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is waking up in the dark with the TV off and the room too quiet. Not just nighttime quiet. Not just you left the sound off, quiet. That same unnatural hush, like someone had wrapped the building in thick blankets. The kind of silence that feels pressurized, like your ears haven't popped after a flight. I stayed very still, that old animal part of my brain telling me that moving would draw attention from something I didn't want to notice me. My eyes were open, but for a second I couldn't tell if they were. That's how dense the dark felt. Then, slowly, shapes began to separate from the black sofa, coffee table, the dull rectangle of the blank TV screen. And then I realized I wasn't seeing my living room at all. The outlines were wrong. The angles didn't match. Where the coffee table should have been, there was open space. Where the TV should have been, there was a low, rounded structure. The smell was wrong, too. Gone was the stale mix of old coffee and cleaning fluid and whatever my downstairs neighbor was always cooking. In its place, dust, sun-warmed plastic, and that faint tang of wet rubber you only notice when you're close to it. My pulse climbed, a slow, climbing drum in my chest, as a simple, stupid thought formed. You are not in your apartment. I sat up or thought I did. The motion felt sluggish, like I was underwater. The dark lightened into a murky, grayish glow, and the shapes sharpened. I knew them before I wanted to admit it. The curve of the slide, the straight lines of the swing set, the low rim of the sandbox. I was sitting on a bench under an oak tree that shouldn't have been in my 7th-floor living room, in a park that should have been miles away. The air had that late afternoon quality again, even though I knew it had been past midnight when I drifted off. "I'm dreaming," I said out loud, because sometimes you have to test the theory. My voice sounded normal, not slowed, not echoing. It just went out into the not quite right air and died there. If it was a dream, it was better constructed than anything my subconscious had ever bothered with. The paint peeling on the slide, the old graffiti I'd painted over 3 times, but could still see if I squinted. The patch of worn rubber where kids always jumped off the swings instead of stopping them. Every detail was right, too right. In dreams, things shift when you look at them. The more I looked, the more this stubbornly stayed itself, or a version of itself, because the sandbox wasn't empty. At first, I thought it was just a trick of shadow, the way the oak's branches cut the late daylight into strips. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, an impression in the sand, like someone had pressed a small body into it and then removed it carefully. The outline of a torso, the curve of a head, the faint depressions where arms might have been. No footprints leading to it, none away. Just that shape, as if the sand remembered someone who wasn't there anymore. My throat went dry. Samanta? I didn't want to say her name, but I also could not say it. In for a penny, in for a haunting. No answer came from the sandbox. Instead, the reply, when it came from behind me. "You weren't supposed to see that." The voice was male, calm, and entirely too close. I turned, heart slamming, expecting what? A man in a coat, a stranger with that hollow look predators always seem to have in old crime shows? Instead, I saw a man in a suit. Mid-30s, maybe, though something about him felt older. Dark hair, neatly cut, no tie. Shirt sleeves rolled up with methodical precision. He was sitting on the other end of the bench, like he'd been there the whole time. One arm draped casually along the backrest, legs crossed at the ankle. He looked like he belonged more in an office than on a playground, but he also looked weirdly at home under that oak tree. I should have stood up. I should have backed away. I should have done 100 things I didn't do. Instead, I just stared. "Who are you?" My voice came out rough. He tilted his head, studied me with an interest that wasn't unkind, but wasn't gentle either. "That's not the first question you want to ask," he said. His accent was hard to place Midwestern, maybe, but sanded down by too much travel. You want to ask if this is real. I swallowed. Is it? He shrugged, glancing around the playground like he was assessing a piece of property. Real enough to leave marks, he said. His eyes flicked toward the sandbox, toward that body-shaped hollow. Real enough to hurt. That's about as real as anything gets, don't you think? I followed his gaze, then forced myself to look back at him. Did you take her? The question was out before I could stop it. He didn't look like a kidnapper. Then again, what does a kidnapper look like, really? They look like everyone else. That's the nightmare of it. He actually laughed at that, not loudly, but with genuine amusement. No, he said. But you already know that, Daniel. Not my style. He said my name the way detectives say it, like it's both a fact and a test. How do you know my name? I demanded, the fear finally catching up with the situation. What is this? Another interrogation? Did Moran put you up to this? The idea that this was some psychologically clever police trick was almost comforting. It put things back in the realm of the explainable. I work a different beat than your Detective Moran, the man said. He chases people. I pay attention to places. He uncrossed his legs, leaned forward slightly, and in that moment I realized what had been bothering me since I first saw him. For all his casual posture, for all his calmness, there was not a speck of dust on him. No stray leaf on his shoe. No crease in his shirt that hadn't been intended. He was too. Crisp for a park bench. Places, I repeated. Like this one. Like this one, he agreed. And like your kitchen, and your hallway. And that patch of sidewalk you nearly stepped off into traffic 3 days ago when you heard the swings. He smiled, small and knowing. You really should be more careful around curbs. A chill slid down my spine. You've been watching me. Not you, he corrected. Her. You're just in the splash zone. I didn't like that phrasing at all. Her as in Samanta, he said without hesitation. 5 years old. Pink shoes, yellow shirt. A tendency to stop and listen where other kids just keep running. Good listener, that one. He said it almost fondly, but there was something under the words I couldn't identify. Not malice, exactly. Not kindness either. Interest, maybe. The clinical curiosity of someone evaluating a specimen. I stood up then, finally, my legs unsteady. The bench, the tree, the whole damn park felt like it was leaning toward him. If you know so much, where is she? The question came out harsher than I intended. Is she alive? Is she... I couldn't finish the sentence. He watched me for a long moment, then looked past me, toward the row of houses beyond the chain-link fence, the streets, the wider city beyond. Alive is a matter of perspective, he said at last. She's not where you think she is. She's not where they think she is either. A slight nod toward where the imaginary police line would have been. That's the trouble with missing people cases. Everyone keeps looking in straight lines. What does that even mean? Anger flared up, a thin, desperate thing. You talk like a fortune cookie. Either tell me something I can use or get out of my head. He looked genuinely amused at that. You think this is your head? Daniel, do you really think you're that imaginative? He gestured around. No, this is one of ours. Think of it as a neutral meeting ground. He frowned slightly, like he was searching for an analogy I'd accept. You know how, sometimes, 2 radio stations bleed into each other? You're trying to listen to one, but you get static and pieces of another coming through. This place is like that, 2 signals overlapping. Every now and then, something slips. Something, I repeated slowly. Or someone? Exactly. He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. Most of the time it's just sound, a shadow, a feeling. Harmless. People write it off as déjà vu or a bad dream. But every so often, the timing is unfortunate. Wrong person, wrong place, right? Interference. He nodded at the sandbox. A child, for instance, with a habit of stopping and listening where she shouldn't. I felt sick. Are you saying she just walked out of the world by mistake? Like stepping between radio stations? He considered that, then tilted his head. Not walked, he said. She was invited. Children hear things adults have learned to ignore. We tune out the static. They don't, not always. When something calls from between the channels, most people never notice. A few do. He shrugged. She answered, the memory of her lips forming that small obedient "Okay," snapped into focus so sharply it hurt. Who called her? I whispered. His eyes flicked up, met mine, and for the first time there was something like caution there. That, he said, is the interesting part, because it wasn't us. He stood then, smooth and unhurried, as if gravity worked differently for him. Up close, he still didn't have that human roughness. No 5 o'clock shadow, no redness in the eyes, no slight asymmetry. If you sketched man in his 30s from memory, you might draw him. You keep saying us, I said. Who is us? He looked genuinely thoughtful, like he hadn't settled on a marketing name yet. Call us maintenance, he said finally. We keep the lines from tangling too much. We fix the knots when we can. We don't usually talk to the people who get caught in the twist. His gaze went to me again, sharper now. You're an exception, because you were standing very close when she crossed. Some of what touched her touched you. That's why you hear the echoes. That's why the cold pockets find you. You're resonant. I'm not a radio, I snapped, though the word maintenance had landed with a bitter kind of irony. No, he agreed. You're worse. You're a witness. He stepped closer, not threatening, but with the inevitability of a tide. And that means you're a risk. To you, to us, to them. Them being whoever called her? I asked. He smiled, but this time there was teeth in it. You're catching on. He glanced at the sandbox again, then at the sky, which had begun to darken in a way that felt less like evening and more like someone dimming a light. Our time's about up. Places like this don't like being held together too long. The scenes complain. Tell me if she's suffering, I said, the words bursting out of me. I didn't care about radio metaphors or lines or whatever maintenance job description he was hinting at. Tell me if she's in pain. I don't care if you say she's in another frequency or whatever. She's a 5-year-old girl. Does she know what's happening? Is she scared? His expression shifted then, just a fraction. Something almost human flickered in his eyes. Fear is complicated where she is, he said slowly. Time doesn't move for her the way it does for you. To her, it might still be the moment she said okay, or the instant before, or 100 variations between. He looked back at me. She is not being hurt in the ways you imagine. That's all I can give you. That's not enough, I said, but the words sounded small, even to me. It's more than most get, he answered. He took a step back, and with that one movement, the entire park seemed to recede, like I was being pulled away from it down a long, invisible tunnel. The colors faded, the edges blurred. He raised a hand in a casual half-salute. You have a choice, Daniel. You can pretend this was just a dream and go back to fixing swings until your knees give out. Or you can start paying attention to the places that hum around you, the knots, the overlaps. You're good with tools. You might even be useful. Useful to who? I managed, as the bench, the tree, the sandbox all stretched away like taffy. To whichever side you decide deserves it, he said. His voice stayed clear, even as his face became a smear of shadow. But be careful. The other side has been calling children longer than you've been alive, and it does not like to be watched. The last thing I saw of him was the glint of a small metal object he tossed toward me, something that spun in the air and caught the too bright, too dim light. I woke up on my living room floor, my neck at an angle my chiropractor would have yelled at me about, the TV dark, the room cold. For a few seconds, everything seemed normal. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. A siren wailed somewhere far off. I almost convinced myself I'd had a particularly vivid nightmare stress, induced, fueled by too much coffee and too many news segments. Then my hand brushed against something on the carpet, a small, cold, metallic shape. I sat up slowly and picked it up. It was a bolt. Ordinary at first glance, same type, I'd tightened 100 times on 100 playgrounds. Hex head, standard thread, but stamped into the flat top, so faint you'd miss it if you weren't looking, were 3 letters. SRM Samanta Railly, missing. I turned it over and over in my hand, the weight of it far greater than its size. Then, without really deciding to, I went to the drawer where I kept Detective Morin's business card. For a long moment, I just stared at the number, at the neat print, at the words special victims. My thumb hovered over the phone. In the end, I didn't call him, because somewhere under the fear and the disbelief and the ordinary human urge to give this to someone with a badge, there was a new, thin, insistent thread of realization. Whatever had taken Samantha, whatever was twisting these places, it wasn't something the police could cuff or question. And for the first time since that day in the sandbox, I had the feeling that if I wanted answers, I was going to have to go looking in places no one sane wanted to go. You'd think that after a night like that, after waking up on the floor with a bolt in your hand that shouldn't exist, and the memory of a man who maybe wasn't a man talking about knots in reality, I'd rush straight into action. That's what stories teach us, right? The hero has a revelation, grabs his coat, and storms off into the unknown, driven by purpose and a swelling soundtrack. Real life doesn't work like that. Real life gives you a supernatural experience on a Tuesday, and still expects you to pay the gas bill on Wednesday. So for a while, I did nothing. Or at least, I did what looked like nothing from the outside. I went to work when they let me. I bought groceries. I nodded at neighbors in the hallway. But underneath the routine, something had shifted. I was listening differently to the way certain corners of the city seemed to hold sound too long, to the way some places felt thicker than others, like walking through air that hadn't gotten the memo about being invisible. The bolt became my unwanted talisman. I kept it in my pocket at first, fingers worrying the stamped letters SRM until the skin on my thumb grew raw. Then I moved it to the small dish on my dresser, where normal people keep keys and loose change. It didn't belong there either. Every time I walked past, it drew my eye the way a bruise does. You don't want to look, but you check anyway to see if it's gotten worse. Part of me thought I should turn it in, march it down to Moran, slap it on his desk, and say, "Explain this." Another part of me, the part that remembered the too crisp man at the bench saying, "You're in the splash zone," wasn't sure bringing more people into it was doing them a favor. It wasn't the bolt that finally pushed me toward doing something. It was a headline. I was in line at a corner store, the kind with bulletproof glass and a clerk who'd seen too much, idly scanning the rotating rack of cheap newspapers. Most of it was the usual: politics, sports, crime. But one small headline, below the fold on a local weekly, snagged my attention. Strange phenomena reported at West Side Playground. The article itself was barely more than filler neighbors complaining about cold spots. A woman insisting she heard children laughing in the park at 2 a.m. when it was visibly empty. A teenage boy claiming his phone glitched out every time he walked past the swings. The reporter had written it with that thin layer of condescension journalists save for UFO sightings and miracle diets, but the phrasing made my pulse spike. Cold spots, laughter with no source, electronics misbehaving in specific spots. It read like a checklist of my last 6 months. I bought the paper, took it home, and spread it out on the table like evidence. Different park, Different neighborhood, same city. The article named the place. A small playground tucked behind an elementary school on the west side, not far from a stretch of track where freight trains crawled through the city at all hours. I traced the little black and white photo with my fingertip. Swings, slide, a low climbing structure. Different layout than 73rd and Halsted, but the feeling in my gut was the same as when Moran had pointed at that sandbox and said, "Here?" It wasn't fear, exactly. It was recognition. I told myself I was just going to look. Not investigate, not intervene, just see if the air there felt the way it had under the oak tree. Curiosity, that's all. That's how it starts for fools in every ghost story, by the way. They always call it curiosity right up until something answers. The schoolyard was quiet when I got there. Late afternoon, overcast sky, that flat gray light that makes everything look like a photograph. The kids were gone for the day. The only movement was a janitor dragging a trash bag toward a dumpster, and a stray dog nosing around a fence post. The playground itself was small but well used. Fresh chalk marks on the pavement. A jacket someone had left hanging on the monkey bars. A lone plastic bucket in the sandbox, overturned like a tiny abandoned helmet. I stood at the edge for a moment, hands in my pockets, just listening. At first, all I heard was normal city noise. Traffic on a nearby street, a plane overhead. Somewhere, a radio playing faint music. No sudden hush, no wrong way shadows. I almost laughed at myself, the tight, slightly hysterical kind of laugh that says you've built up a monster in your head and found nothing in the closet but old coats. Then I stepped forward. It was subtle, almost gentle, the shift you feel when an elevator starts moving. That tiny tug in your stomach that says, we're not on solid ground anymore. The temperature dipped a few degrees. Not dramatically, not enough that anyone else would have noticed on a cool day, but I felt it along my arms, in the thin skin at the back of my neck. The sound around me didn't vanish this time. It just receded, like someone had closed a door to the street, and I was suddenly in a quieter room. I walked toward the swings first. Old habit. Check the chains, check the seats. That's what I told myself I was doing, falling back on the comfort of a job I understood. The metal felt normal against my hand, cold, slightly gritty with city grime. No ghostly tingles, no static. I let it swing once and watched it make a slow arc. For a second, nothing happened. Then, from behind me, a second chain creaked. I turned. The other swing was moving, just a little. Not much. The gentlest sway, the kind a kid might give it before deciding they were bored. Could have been the wind, I told myself, except there wasn't any. The trees at the edge of the yard were still. The air on my face was heavy and unmoving. The swing creaked again, rocking back a fraction more. "Okay," I said quietly, forcing my voice to stay level. Very funny. I wasn't sure who I was talking to. The universe. The maintenance man, the other side he'd warned me about. Or maybe myself, trying to prove I wasn't about to bolt, no pun intended, like a spooked animal. The swing slowed, then stopped. The quiet thickened. For a heartbeat, I had the strangest sense of being watched from above, like there was something perched on the school roof, peering down with interest. I looked up, half expecting to see the neat silhouette of that man in the suit against the sky. Nothing. Just a few pigeons and a vent puffing out some indistinct white. "Fine," I muttered. "You got my attention. Now what?" What came next wasn't a sound or a movement. It was a memory that didn't belong to me. Suddenly, I was seeing the playground, not as it was in that moment, but as it had been months, maybe years earlier. The grass at the edges was thinner, the paint was less chipped, the trees were shorter. Children's voices filled the air, layered on top of each other in that chaotic, joyful way kids have. A teacher's whistle, a ball bouncing, and over it all, a sharp cry. "Tommy! Get down from there right now." I blinked, grabbed the swing chain to steady myself, and the overlay flickered. For a second, I could see both versions at once, the empty playground in front of me and the crowded, sun-splashed one superimposed over it like a double exposure. A boy's foot landed where my own had been a heartbeat earlier, right through my leg, his outline translucent. Then the image snapped away, leaving only the present, cold and still. Did you see that? I asked the air, because talking to empty spaces had apparently become a hobby. My heart was pounding, not with fear exactly, but with the dizzy sense of having looked sideways at time and found out it had layers. That depends on what you think you saw. The voice came from my right this time, and I didn't need to turn to know who it belonged to. I turned anyway, slowly. Same man, same suit, same rolled sleeves, same unsettling absence of small imperfections. He was standing by the sandbox, hands in his pockets, looking down at something I couldn't see from where I was. You again, I said, because my brain hadn't decided on anything smarter. You stalking all the city's playgrounds, or just the haunted ones? Haunted is such a dramatic word, he replied mildly. I prefer overlapping. He glanced up. And I told you. Places are my job. You came to my work site, Daniel. I walked toward him, each step making that barely noticeable resistance in the air more pronounced, like walking deeper into water. Did you bring me here? I asked. To this one? Or is it just another knot doing its thing? Credit where it's due, he said, nodding slightly. You came on your own. That's encouraging. He stepped to the side then, revealing what he'd been looking at. In the sandbox, near the edge closest to the swings, was a small circular depression. Not a footprint, not this time. A perfect ring, as if someone had pressed the bottom of a cup into the sand and lifted it straight up. Inside the circle, the sand was darker, slightly damp, even though it hadn't rained in days. Tiny lines radiated from the center, like the spokes of a wheel. What is that? I asked, though a part of me already knew the answer would sound like nonsense. An anchor, he said, or the scar from one, depending on how you look at it. Something reached through here, briefly, enough to tug, not enough to snatch. He looked at me again. Yet, I thought of the article, the cold spots, the phantom laughter. Any kids gone missing from this one? I asked. Not the way you mean, he said. No open cases, no flyers, no grieving press conferences, but a few near misses. A child standing stock, still at the edge of the sand, eyes unfocused, parents screaming their name until they blink and start crying. A boy found sitting on the slide stairs at midnight, insisting it's still recess. A girl who swears she played with a friend whose name no one else remembers. Little things. Almost things. I swallowed hard. And you just watch this? Take notes? Wait until it gets bad enough to clean up? He studied me, weighing his words. We're not omnipotent, Daniel, or omnipresent. Think of reality like an old building. It shifts, it settles, cracks form. You patch what you can reach. You shore up load-bearing walls. Sometimes a stair collapses before you get there. Sometimes someone falls through. Like Samanta, he agreed. No flinch, no apology. Just acknowledgement. I stared at the ring in the sand. You said last time that they called her, the other side. If this, I gestured around us, at the subtle pressure, the faint wrongness, is a scar from one of their attempts, why is it happening again? Why here? Because whatever you want to call them, entities, forces, hungry gaps in the pattern, they pay attention to where the fabric is already thin, he said. A successful pull leaves a weak spot. They test those. Probe. If no one notices, they push harder next time. Maybe they take sound first, then light. Then, he let the sentence trail off, but I didn't need him to finish. So this place is on a list, I said, marked, He smiled faintly. Everything is on a list. Some things are just higher priorities. And you're letting it stay here? I demanded, anger cutting through the fear. Kids play here. You just said there were near misses. Why not shut it down? Pour concrete over the whole thing. Put a building on top. Do something. We do, he said, in a way. Sometimes parks close. Sometimes budgets get cut. Sometimes a playground is quietly removed and replaced with a parking lot. People think it's politics, or neglect, or changing neighborhood needs. It's easier that way. But closing every knot isn't feasible. And besides, he gave me a look that was half challenge, half invitation. If we sealed them all, we'd never learn anything. About them. Or about you. About me, I repeated, thrown. He nodded toward my hand. You brought the bolt, didn't you? I froze. I hadn't thought about it when I left my apartment, but my fingers had gone to my pocket on their own as I walked. Now, feeling its outline under the fabric, I realized he was right. I brought it like a pilgrim brings a relic. I pulled it out, the metal cool against my palm, and held it up. You gave me this. I let you keep it, he corrected. It didn't come from me. It came from the overlap. From the moment you and she shared. You could call it fallout. His eyes flicked to it with a strange interest. Most people don't get physical souvenirs. You did. That makes you useful. You keep saying that, I said. Useful how, exactly? I'm a guy with bad knees and a toolbox, not a whatever you are. Exactly, he said. You're a man with tools, with access, with a reason to go places no one questions. Know how many of these are on public land? Parks, schoolyards, empty lots the city forgot about? You're already in the building every day, Daniel. You're just now starting to see where the walls bow. A cold realization settled over me. You want me to, what? Map them? Report them? Fix them? Notice them, he said simply. Pay attention. When the air thickens, when the sound drops, when you hear laughter with no source, or footsteps that don't match the number of people in the room. Mark those spots. Mention a safety concern in your reports. Get equipment removed. Get benches moved. Sometimes all it takes is shifting the pattern a few feet to throw off a pull. Other times, he shrugged. Other times it's more complicated. And what do I get out of this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Besides a front row seat to things that make people lose sleep? He looked at me steadily. You get closer to understanding what happened to her. You get a chance, no promises, no guarantees, but a chance to be there if the line ever loops back around where she is. And you get something most people never do in cases like this. A job to do that's not just sit and wait for news that never comes. His voice softened, just a fraction. You can't save the child who's already gone, Daniel. But you might help prevent the next one from stepping into a voice that isn't hers. I looked at the ring in the sand, at the dampness that didn't match the weather, at the way the air around. It felt like the echo of a hand that had already let go. I thought about Samantha's mother, shoulders shaking in that police station room. I thought about the phantom laugh in my kitchen, the lone footprint in a sandbox miles from here, the letters SRM pressed into the bolt like a brand on my conscience. I'm not a hero, I said quietly. I'm not even sure I'm stable anymore. Heroes are overrated, he replied. And stability is just a word people use when nothing strange has happened to them yet. He glanced up at the school building, where a classroom light flicked on, casting a weak rectangle onto the grass. The bell's going to ring in a minute. Kids will come pouring out. If you're going to decide you don't want to be involved, now's the time to walk away. And if I decide I do? I asked. He smiled, small and satisfied. Then we start with what you know. One missing girl, one bolt. A handful of knots you've already felt. And we see how many of these places we can nudge before the other side realizes you're watching them back. The school bell rang then, shrill and ordinary, cutting through the heavy air. The pressure around us loosened, like the moment between breaths. The strange quiet thinned under the oncoming tide of normal noise, children shouting, doors banging, teachers calling names. When I looked back at the sandbox, the dark ring in the sand was already fading, edges crumbling into the rest of the grit. If I hadn't seen it moments before, I'd never have known it was there. I closed my hand around the bolt until the stamped letters dug into my skin, took a slow breath, and didn't step away. The place that closed the loop wasn't on any of my usual routes. It wasn't even inside city limits. I found it the way you find most dangerous things these days, by following something you should have scrolled past. It started with a late-night rabbit hole, the kind you fall into when sleep won't come, and the glow of a screen feels preferable to the company of your own thoughts. I wasn't searching for haunted playgrounds, not specifically. I was looking up reports of strange weather pockets, local cold spots, unexplained child experiences, the kind of vague phrases that get you half ghost stories and half science articles about microclimates. Somewhere between an article about odd temperature inversions and a forum thread on places your dog refuses to walk, I saw a sentence that made my skin prickle. There's this old campground outside the city with a rusted jungle gym. Kids say, if you play there at dusk, you hear other kids laughing, but there's never anyone else around. Old campground. Rusted jungle gym. Dusk. Laughter with no source. The post was 3 lines long, written by someone with a username that sounded like a joke, probably never meant to be taken seriously. But by then, I'd learned that the line between urban legend and useful lead is thinner than people think. I jotted down the directions someone had replied with, "Take 55 out past the last exit anyone uses. Look for the broken sign with the pine tree on it. Follow the dirt road till you hit the lake," and told myself I was just curious. Curious is a liar's word. Underneath it was something sharper. Recognition. The pattern on my hand-drawn map had been nudging toward the city's edge for a while. Maybe it didn't stop there. It took me nearly an hour to get out there, longer than it should have. The GPS gave up halfway, the blue dot stubbornly hovering over a blank stretch of green, like it didn't want to admit there was anything worth mapping. I drove with the window cracked, the late-day air sliding in, carrying the smell of cut fields and something damp and leafy. The city fell away behind me, replaced by those in-between areas that never quite make it into postcards' warehouse clusters, half-abandoned strip malls, gas stations whose lights flicker a little too much. Eventually, the road narrowed. The last landmark I recognized was a sagging billboard advertising a fireworks store that had clearly closed years ago. Beyond that, trees. Not the careful, planted kind from city parks, but the older, wilder kind that grow where they please and drop leaves where they like. I spotted the broken sign from the post. What was left of it, anyway? A faded green triangle that might once have been a pine tree, half its letters missing. Underscore Akevu Camp underscore round, close enough. The dirt road beyond felt less like a maintained path and more like something the forest tolerated. Ruts, potholes, branches that whispered against the sides of the truck. I drove slow, headlights cutting through the early evening haze, until the trees thinned and the world opened up into a clearing. The remnants of the campground lay scattered around a small lake, its surface smooth and dark, reflecting the bruised colors of the sky. Most of it was what you'd expect from a place the city stopped funding a decade ago. Collapsed picnic tables, fire rings choked with weeds, a bathhouse with boarded-up windows and graffiti that hadn't been updated in a while. But off to one side, near a cluster of pines that leaned toward each other like conspirators, I saw the thing that had dragged me out there. A metal play structure, rusted in places, but stubbornly upright. 2 swings, a low slide, a bent ladder. The ground around it was bare dirt, no safety mats, no rubber pellets. Just earth, packed down by feet that hadn't walked there in years. I stepped out of the truck and immediately felt it. Not a slam, not the abrupt, suffocating quiet of the city knots, but a gentle pressure at the edge of perception. Like the air here had a texture you didn't notice until you moved through it. The usual campground sounds were their wind and leaves, water lapping the shore, but under them was a faint, steady hum, as if some low frequency had been turned on and left running. For a moment, standing there with the engine ticking as it cooled, I thought about turning around, getting back in the truck, going home, chalking this up as one more almost thing. No one would know. No one was waiting on a report. The man in the suit hadn't appeared on the hood to scold me. But that's the thing about carrying a bolt stamped with a missing child's initials in your pocket. It changes the math on what you can walk away from. I walked toward the playground. Up close, it was even more of a relic. The metal was faded to a dull, uncertain color between blue and gray. The chains on the swings were spotted with orange. The slide had a layer of fine dirt on it, undisturbed except for one streak where rain had carved a path. No fresh footprints, no candy wrappers, no signs kids had been here recently. Just the stubborn geometry of a structure that was built to outlast attention spans. The air thickened with each step. Sound stretched like it had a little further to travel. I could still hear the water, the wind, a bird calling somewhere in the trees, but they all sounded like they were one room over, with the door mostly closed. I reached out and laid my hand on the nearest swing chain. It was cold, colder than the air warranted. Not ice cold, Not supernatural horror movie cold, just the kind of wrong temperature that makes your skin pull back for a second in protest. "Okay," I said quietly. "I'm here. Now what?" For a while, nothing happened. That's the thing no one tells you about strange experiences. They come with a lot of waiting. You stand in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you listen. You second, guess yourself. You wonder if you finally tipped over the edge into someone who murmurs to empty campgrounds. The sky dimmed another shade. The first stars, weak and unsure, began to poke through. The hum under everything stayed steady, personal and impersonal at the same time. Then, without warning, the seesaw moved. It was off to the side, half buried in weeds. One seat tipped into the dirt, the other raised. It had been still when I walked past it. Now, slowly, it rocked, down an inch. Up an inch, down, up. Like someone light was shifting their weight on one end. The vines clinging to its frame trembled with the motion. I didn't move closer. I'd learned that much. Instead, I stood my ground and forced my voice to be steady. Who's there? If this were a neat story, a small voice would have answered. A name, maybe. A giggle that said, "Come play." What I got instead was a sound that was worse in its vagueness. A blur of noise that might have been laughter, might have been crying, might have been both run backward through a machine. It came from somewhere between the swing set and the lake, from a patch of air that had no business making any sound at all. The seesaw rocked a little higher. The hum intensified, not louder, but closer, like it had wrapped around my ribs. For a dizzy second, I thought I felt another set of hands on the chains of the swing I was touching. Small hands, layering over mine, fingers not quite aligning with my own. My skin prickled, every fine hair on my arm standing up. Samanta? I said it before I could stop myself. It felt like opening a door and shouting into the dark, hoping the one person you miss will answer, and not whoever else might be listening. The hum stuttered. I don't know how else to describe it. It was as if something in that underlying vibration skipped a beat, tripped, then scrambled to catch up. The seesaw slammed down a little harder, sending a small puff of dust into the air. Somewhere near the lake, something splashed, though the surface stayed smooth in front of me. Then, over all of it, clear and unmistakable, I heard it. Okay, a child's voice. The same small, obedient word I'd watched form on her lips in the sandbox. Not a memory this time. Not a replay in my head. The sound existed in the air, as real as the wind in the water and the ticking of a cooling engine. It came from the space just behind my left shoulder, close enough that if I turned, I expected to see a small figure standing there. I turned. No one. Only the outline of the trees, the dark mirror of the lake, the rusting bones of the playground. But the air where the voice had come from felt thin, like a spot on old tape that's been played too many times. "Samanta," I said again, more carefully now. "If you can hear me, if you're—" I stopped. What was the right verb? Alive? There? Stuck? None of them seemed to fit. If that was you, I heard you. It sounded pathetic, like a man reassuring himself more than anyone else, but it was all I had. The hum shifted, not stronger, not weaker, just directional. It pressed against my back, nudging me a half step toward the lake. The bolt in my pocket felt heavier, dragging my jacket down on one side. I took a tentative step in the direction that pressure suggested. The air grew denser. Another step. The water loomed closer, black and depthless. Careful. The warning snapped across the space like a snapped branch. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. His voice had already carved its own niche in my memory. But I turned anyway, because you look at the thing that can pull you back from an edge, even if you're not sure you want to be pulled. He stood a few yards away, between me and the rest of the clearing, hands in his pockets, that same infuriating calm on his face. In the fading light, He looked less crisp than before, like whoever had drawn him had used a softer pencil. "You're early," he said. "Or they're impatient. Hard to tell sometimes." "You knew about this place," I said. It wasn't an accusation so much as a weary statement. "It's one of your knots. One of everyone's knots," he corrected. "Places like this don't belong to anyone. Campgrounds, lakes, the edges where city gives way to knot. Quite wilderness. There, porous by nature. People come to get away from their lives, to sleep on thinner pillows between themselves and the world. Things notice." He nodded toward the lake. "Don't go any closer than that log." I glanced down. My toes were nearly touching a half-submerged log at the water's edge, slick with algae. Another step, and I'd have been on the muddy slope. "What happens if I do?" I asked, even though the answer was already squirming at the back of my mind. "You might find out what she sees," he said. "Problem is, coming back from that view is not guaranteed. And we've put too much into you to let you drown in someone else's perspective." I stepped back, more quickly than I meant to. The hum eased off my spine, a faint protest in its tone. The seesaw settled. The air loosened a notch. I exhaled shakily. "That was her," I said. "The okay. It sounded like her." "It sounded like your memory of her," he said gently. "Or like the imprint of that moment on this pattern. Or like both. When lines cross, echoes don't stay in their lanes very well." I wanted to hit him. Not because he was wrong, but because he was so infuriatingly detached from the weight the word carried for me. Instead, I clamped my jaw shut and dug my nails into my palm until I felt the crescent sting. "Why here?" I managed. "Why a campground an hour out of the city? What does this have to do with any of it?" He walked closer to the swing set, eyes scanning the rusted metal, the packed earth, the dark water beyond. "You started seeing the curve on your map," he said. "You noticed it leaning outward. You were right. The knots don't respect your municipal boundaries. Whatever's tugging on your side of the line isn't content with alleyway corners and schoolyards anymore. It's reaching for the spaces in between, the places people slip out of their routines, retreats, lakes, roads where the radio cuts out for no good reason." He nodded toward the tree line, where the dirt road vanished back into shadow. "Ever notice how many roadside crosses cluster around certain bends?" I had. I just hadn't let myself think about it this way. "You're telling me car accidents are because of this?" I gestured at the unseen pressure, the hum, the rusted jungle gym. "I'm telling you some accidents aren't as random as you'd like to think," he replied. "A driver blinks a little too long. A song on the radio hits exactly the wrong nerve. A shadow crosses the road that isn't attached to anything. Attention slips, not because they're careless, but because something tugs. Not hard, just enough." The idea made my stomach twist. Not because it was more monstrous than a drunk driver or a slick patch of ice, but because it moved the locus of danger out of the tangible and into the uncanny. How do you fight a bend in reality? "You said, 'We have put too much into me,'" I said. "What does that mean? You show up, drop cryptic hints, and vanish. I do the walking and the listening and the not sleeping. What exactly are you investing, besides words?" For the first time since I'd met him, he looked almost tired. Not in the human way, with sagging shoulders or dark circles under the eyes, but in a subtle lessening of sharpness, as if the edges of him had rubbed against too many rough surfaces. "Every time we hold a place like this open long enough for you to stand in it and not go under, it costs," he said. "Every nudge, every interference that keeps you from stepping past that log when the call is strongest, every time we keep them from noticing that someone's watching the watchers, it all adds up. You're not the only thread we're managing. But you are one of the few that can move where we can't." "Why me?" I asked. It came out rawer than I'd intended. Out of all the people at that playground that day, out of every parent and cop and neighbor. Why the maintenance guy with a bad back? Why not Moran? Why not her mother? Because you were looking at two things at once, he said simply. You had one eye on the bolt and one on the child. You were anchored to the structure and aware of the person. Most people pick one. The ones who see only the bolts, the measurements, the paperwork. They can't feel the hum, even when it's rattling their teeth. The ones who see only the child, the tragedy, the grief, they get swallowed whole by it. You straddle both. It's messy. It's unpleasant. It's exactly what we needed. I didn't have an answer for that. It sounded too neat, too story-shaped, but it also rang with a sour kind of truth. I'd spent years toggling between technical reports and late-night guilt, between tightening the bolts and replaying the moment I'd failed to protect the child near them. If that fractured attention had made me a useful tool in someone else's invisible job, it was a bitter consolation. The sky had gone properly dark now, the last smear of color gone from the edge of the lake. The hum was subsiding, the air loosening, as if whatever had been probing at this place had pulled back for now. Crickets started up at the edge of the clearing, their rough chorus oddly comforting. So what happens next? I asked. I keep wandering into these knots until one of them snaps shut on me. I map them, shift a bench here, flag a slide there, and hope the other side gets bored and moves on to some city where no one's watching. What's the endgame? He smiled, but there was no humor in it. Endgames are above my level, he said. I do triage. You do legwork. Maybe, if we're stubborn and lucky, fewer kids vanish into voices only they can hear. Maybe, if you're very stubborn and very lucky, one particular line loops back close enough to touch. His gaze flicked toward the lake, then back to me. Or maybe none of that happens, and all you get out of this is a map of places where the world feels thin, and the knowledge that it's not as solid as everyone pretends. That's a hell of a sales pitch, I muttered. You already bought in, he said softly. The day you picked up that bolt instead of dropping it, you stopped being just a bystander, whether you knew it or not. We stood there in silence for a while, listening to the crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the small lap of water against the shore. The seesaw had gone still. The swing I'd touched hung motionless, no phantom hands sharing the chain. If someone had driven up then, with a cooler and a tent, they'd have seen nothing but an old man and a slightly younger one standing in a forgotten campground, lost in thought. You said they don't like to be watched, I said finally. The other side, the ones calling kids. If I keep doing this, if I keep noticing, mapping, poking at there, what did you call it? Overlap. What happens when they notice me back? For the first time, something like genuine concern crossed his face. It wasn't dramatic. Just a tightening around the eyes, a small downward tilt at the corners of his mouth. They already have, he said. They noticed you the moment you heard that first laugh in your kitchen. The question isn't if they've noticed. It's why they haven't acted on it yet. And, I prodded, when he didn't immediately continue. And, he said slowly, either they think you're not worth the effort yet, or they're curious. He met my eyes. You don't want them to be curious, Daniel. Curiosity means they start testing, pushing, seeing what happens when they pull a little harder on the thread with your name on it. A gust of wind moved through the trees then, the first strong one since I'd arrived. It sent a ripple across the lake, a shiver through the rusted playground, a whisper through the dry grass. The hum under everything flickered and then, for now, was gone. Just an ordinary abandoned campground at night, with all the ordinary dangers that already entails. Go home, he said, stepping back, his outline already less distinct against the dark. Write down what you felt here. Mark it on your map. Don't come back to this one for a while. Animals don't leave a trap alone once they've scented something interesting in it. And you? I asked, where do you go when you're not haunting seesaws? He smiled that small, not quite human smile. Somewhere you'd call between. Try not to fall into it without an invitation. Then, as casually as if he were walking behind a curtain, he stepped toward the space between two pines and was gone. No flash, no sound. One moment he occupied a slice of the world. The next, that slice was empty. I stood there a long time after that, the bolt warm in my hand from the grip I hadn't realized I'd kept on it. Eventually, the practical parts of me still blessedly present, still concerned with things like hypothermia and brake pads, and whether the truck would start nudged me toward leaving. I walked back to the vehicle, each step away from the play structure, making the air feel lighter, the night noises more properly noisy. As I drove back toward the city, the dirt road giving way to pavement, the trees to streetlights, I realized something that should have been obvious, but hadn't fully landed until then. Whatever had taken Samanta wasn't a single event frozen in the past. It was part of an ongoing process, a slow pulling and testing at the edges of where we live. And I, for better or worse, was now part of the feedback loop. Back home, under the familiar rattle of old pipes and distant traffic, I spread the map on the table again. The marks inside the city, the faint curve pushing outward, the new X I added for the campground, they all sat there, ink on paper, pretending to be simple. I traced the line with my finger. It wasn't a circle yet. Not quite, but it was bending, arcing back, toward 73rd and Halsted, toward the sandbox where a 5-year-old had said, okay, to something no one else could hear. And, whether I wanted it to or not, toward me. If you'd asked me, before all this, what a circle felt like, I'd have talked about geometry, angles, degrees, maybe about how kids draw them too wide on one side, flat on the other. I wouldn't have thought to tell you that a circle can feel like pressure, like a tightening band around a city, a life, a memory. But that's what it was in the weeks after the campground, a slowly closing loop pulling everything back toward where it had started. My map made it obvious before my mind wanted to admit it. Every new mark, every knot I felt on the edges of parks and alleys and schoolyards, when I backed up and looked at the whole sheet of paper, the curve they'd been hinting at had finished its arc. The line started near the lake, swept through the west side, brushed downtown, hooked south, and ended landed right back on 73rd and Halsted, the sandbox. Ground zero. I stared at that X until the ink blurred. Of course it came back there. Stories like this don't wander off into the woods and stay there. They return to the scene of the crime, the wound, the first bad decision. It's what people do when they can't let go. Apparently, it's what whatever lived between the channels did too. I tried to ignore it at first. Not the map, I couldn't unsee that, but the call. For a few days, I buried myself in the most mundane repairs I could find. Loose bolts on benches, a railing that needed repainting, a drinking fountain that coughed more rust than water. I avoided 73rd and Halsted the way you avoid a person you owe an apology to and aren't ready to face yet. I told myself it was strategy, that going there too soon, too scared, would make me sloppy. The truth was simpler. I was afraid. Afraid of what I'd find. Afraid I'd find nothing. Afraid that after months of listening to whispers in the fabric of the city, I'd step back into that park and discover it was just a patch of ground with a bench and a sandbox. And the only thing that had ever been strange about it was the hole I'd let one child's disappearance carve in my life. In the end, the decision was made for me by something as stupid and human as habit. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee on a gray Saturday when the phone rang. Not the cell, the landline. Nobody important uses landlines anymore, unless they really want to reach someone who's been trying to disappear. I almost let it go to the machine. Then an old reflex kicked in, one honed by years of being on call for the city, of knowing a midnight leak or a noon collapse didn't care about weekends. Carter, I said, the word automatic. Daniel, it's Moran. I hadn't heard his voice in months. It still carried that mix of gravel and skepticism, like every word had to push through a layer of second guessing before it made it out. Detective, I said carefully. This is a surprise. Yeah, well, cold cases get lonely, he replied. Paper shuffled on his end. Got a minute? I looked at the map on the table, at the X on 73rd, and Halsted now pulling every other mark toward it like a drain. I've got a few. Good. A pause. You still at the same address? Yeah. Then I'll talk on the way, he said. We're driving. I stood up so fast the chair scraped the floor. We? You and me, he said. I'm out front. Put your shoes on. For a second, my brain served up a half-formed image of the too crisp man behind the wheel of an unmarked car, smiling that thin smile, while Moran rode shotgun, oblivious. I shook it off, grabbed my jacket, and went to the window. It was just Moran, leaner than I remembered, more gray at the temples, but undeniably human wrinkled suit, takeaway coffee cup on the roof of the sedan while he checked something on his phone. No other figure in the car. No strange stillness clinging to the vehicle. The world outside looked like a regular city morning. Someone walking a dog, someone arguing into a headset, a bus sighing at the corner stop. I locked up and headed down. He didn't say much as I got in, just nodded and pulled away from the curb. The car smelled like old fast food and stale cologne. A city cop's car lived in more than his own living room. For a few blocks, we drove in silence. How you been? He asked finally, like he was trying to remember the small talk script. Busy, I said. You? He snorted. We're both too old to pretend this is a reunion. Another pause. You heard about the budget meetings? They're talking about shutting down a few playgrounds. My heart jerked. Which ones? The one by the river, the pocket park downtown, that schoolyard you probably saw on the news last month when somebody tagged it up. He glanced at me. And 73rd and Halsted. I swallowed. Thought that one was already half abandoned. Officially? No. Unofficially? After what happened, parents started going elsewhere when they could. But it's still on the books. Still supposed to be maintained. He gave me a pointed look. Supposed to be. I let that land. What's this about, Moran? You didn't drag me out of my apartment on a Saturday to talk park funding. He hesitated, and for a second, I saw something I hadn't seen on him before. Uncertainty. We had a call, he said. A woman walking her dog early yesterday. Said she heard kids playing at 73rd in Halsted. Laughter, squealing, chain squeaking. Thought maybe the school had opened a weekend program. Came around the corner, and the place was empty. He took a breath. She said the swings were moving. The words landed between us like a stone dropped in a pond. Every part of me wanted to look out the window, anywhere but at his face. I kept my eyes on the dashboard. The temperature gauge hummed along. The fuel needle sat just above a quarter tank. Mundane little truths, stubborn in their normalcy. You think somebody was there, and she missed them, I said, out of habit. That was the first thought, he replied. Second thought was teenagers messing around. Third thought was that the woman had an overactive imagination, and maybe a bottle in her bag. He glanced at me again. Fourth thought, I didn't like much. Which is why we're on thought number 5. You? Me, I repeated dry. Always glad to be thought number 5. He shrugged, the motion tight. You were the last adult to see that kid. You kept turning up in my reports, in my notes, even when I was working other cases. Either because you were there, or because people kept bringing you up. Maintenance guy. Witness. The man in the park. When I heard about the swings, I thought, you know this place a hell of a lot better than I do, whether I like it or not. You think I put speakers in the trees? I asked, remote control swings? If I thought that, I'd have brought you in, not picked you up, he said. No, I think you see things there I don't. And before you say anything smart, I mean that in the least mystical way possible. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. You told me once that something felt off about that day. Air. Sound. I wrote it off as shock. Maybe I shouldn't have. That admission sat heavier than anything else he'd said. It wasn't a confession of belief, not exactly. But it was a crack in the armor. We pulled up on 73rd a few minutes later. The park looked smaller than it did in my memory, the way childhood places always do. The oak tree still spread its branches over the bench. The chain link fence still sagged in one spot. The sandbox still sat there, a dull rectangle of packed sand. The surface wind rippled. The swings moved a little in the breeze, just enough to blur the line between physics and something else. We got out. The morning was cool, the sky a flat sheet. A couple of joggers went past without looking in. A woman pushed a stroller on the opposite sidewalk, eyes on her phone. The world rolled on, indifferent. You feel anything? Moran asked, half mocking, half serious. Any of that air got heavy business? Give it a minute, I said softly. We walked in. The crunch of gravel under our shoes sounded too loud to me, as if someone had turned up only that channel and turned the rest down. The hum was back before we made it halfway to the oak. Less obvious than at the campground, more familiar, like the returning ache of an old injury when the weather shifts. Under the tree, I stopped. The sandbox looked exactly like any other neglected sandbox, small, drifts and tiny dunes where the wind and weather had had their way. But dead center, where I'd last seen a single footprint years ago, the sand lay in a shallow depression. Not as sharp as before, not a crisp shoe shape. More like something heavy had rested there a long time and then lifted. A memory of weight. Moran followed my gaze. What? He asked. See something? Not see, I said. Feel. My voice came out low, almost reverent despite myself. You don't hear the difference? He frowned and tilted his head slightly. A cop listening for a sound at a closed door. For a second, his face went slack, like he was aligning some inner set of dials. Then, very slowly, his expression changed. Not dramatically. Just a tiny pull between his brows, a narrowing of his eyes. What is that? He murmured. Like the sound from the streets down a hallway. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but from the sharp relief that came with someone else finally putting words to it. Yeah, I said. That. A gust of wind rattled the leaves. The swings creaked. Out of reflex, we both turned toward them. 2 seats. 2 chains. Rocking a little harder than the wind warranted. Back and forth, in sync. Kids do come here sometimes, Moran muttered, as if arguing with himself. Teens. They hang out, they drink. Could have left them like that. Sure, I said. Could have. I stepped closer to the sandbox. The pressure in the air thickened, wrapping around my chest. My heartbeat sounded too loud. I glanced back at him. You wanted me here. Let me do what you brought me for. He hesitated, then gave a tight nod, the kind a man gives when he's not sure if he's handing a hammer to a carpenter or a loaded gun to a toddler. I'm right here, he said. You feel like you're about to pass out. You sit down. You see anyone who shouldn't be here. You tell me. I moved into the subtle center of the space, right up to the edge of the shallow depression. My foot sank a fraction into the sand. The hum rose, not in volume, but in clarity. It had layers. I hadn't noticed that before. There was a low, steady vibration, like the one at the campground. Over it, a higher, thinner whine. And threaded through both, faint but unmistakable, the echo of children's voices. Not screaming, not crying, just playing. Running sounds, broken shouts, the kind of noise you hear from a block away on a summer afternoon. Except this wasn't summer, and no kids were in sight. I closed my eyes. "Okay," I said quietly. Not to her this time. To the place. To whatever was leaning through. "You've had your fun. You've taken. You've tested. You've left marks from here to the damn lake. You wanted somebody to notice? You got him. I'm noticing. I've been noticing. So now I'm asking, what do you want?" It felt ridiculous, standing there addressing thin air like it was a person. But the alternative standing mute felt worse. At least this way, the conversation had a direction. For a few heartbeats, nothing changed. Then the hum pitched up. Have you ever had your ears pop in an airplane? That moment when the pressure equalizes with a soft, unpleasant click? Imagine that, but sideways. Not in your ears, in your head. In the space behind your eyes where your sense of here lives. The world snapped. I didn't pass out. I didn't leave my body. I didn't see my life flash before my eyes. What happened was somehow stranger and quieter. Reality slid half an inch to the left and took me with it. My eyes were still closed, but the darkness behind them lightened. I smelled heat, the very specific smell of hot rubber and sugar and sunscreen. I heard kids laughing, not echo-thin this time, but full and immediate, overlapping in shrill, joyful chaos. A radio played somewhere, tinny and far away. Someone called, "Sammy? Juice or water?" in that soft, indulgent tone adults use at picnics. I opened my eyes. The park was the same and not. The oak tree's leaves were thicker, greener, the branches a little lower. The paint on the slide was fresh, the graffiti absent, the bench's wood wasn't faded. The sandbox god was full of toys. Buckets, shovels, a half-built castle. A cartoon-patterned blanket spread on the grass held paper plates and a cake that hadn't started to sag yet. Adults clustered around the picnic table, younger, laughing, not yet carrying the particular stiffness that comes from decades of bad news.